Today I'm going to give you a presentation that was just given to select Coldwell Banker real estate agents by the chief economist for the National Association of Realtors, Lawrence Yun, who talked about the housing market, shared some key stats with us, and also hinted at what may be coming in 2025. I'm going to be walking through his data set, and I'm also going to provide you with my own kind of analysis based on information I have, boots on the ground insights. And so what we're looking at here is the total payroll jobs. So since 2000, over 30 million jobs were created. And you can actually see the dip that happened right during the COVID years, but recovered fairly quickly, and we're now at an all-time high when it comes to payroll job creation. What's really interesting about this slide here is that the total jobs that were added since pre-COVID in 2020 up until February of 2025 is 7 million, which is actually 25% from that previous chart here, over 30 million. So just in a matter of a few years, we added 7 million payroll jobs. So most of us know of the government initiative called DOGE, which stands for Department of Government Efficiency, spearheaded by Elon Musk, which is looking to reduce waste. In February, federal government employee jobs were actually down by 10,000. So there's a lot of layoffs that are happening right now, and you've seen it in the news. If we look at local government employees that were added, in February, about 20,000 jobs were actually added. So, as Lawrence Yun says, one sector may be losing employees, another sector may be gaining employees, which we're seeing here in the local government employee addition. But the question still remains, holistically speaking, where we're going to be towards the end of 2025 when it comes to the net effect of cutting jobs and adding jobs. Here's a chart that is color coordinated, and it's color coordinated to indicate the payroll employment change from March 2020 to December 2024. If you're seeing your state being green, per Lawrence Yun, he would call that the superstar states. They've done really well in terms of payroll employment additions. The ones in dark blue are doing just above average. The ones in light blue are doing below average when it comes to the national average. So we know that there's been so many videos out there for the last few years that have said that the national housing market is crashing, that prices are going to be crashing way worse than in 2008. And thus far, it just hasn't held true. But if there was a crash, it really came down to existing home sales, which are much, much lower. And this impacts much more a real estate agent that is making their bread and butter selling homes. The less homes they have to sell, the less money they're going to be making. So if we look at existing home sales, we've had, according to this chart, two of the most difficult years. And you can actually see the comparison of 2024 to some of the previous years. And so over the last 5 years, this was absolutely one of the lowest existing home sales that we've seen. But what's interesting is that the new home sales, so this is new construction we're speaking about here, actually increased from 2022 to 2024. And I can actually say that in the market I work in, which is Sarasota County, Manatee County, we're seeing a lot of new construction communities. Because there's so many new construction homes on the market, they're taken away from existing home sales. It's putting pressure on the existing home median prices as well. Let's look at home price gains just from 2020 to Q4 of 2024. I'm in Florida, so my eye goes right to Florida over here. Prices have come up in a matter of almost 5 years by 70%. In some places in Florida, the prices actually doubled. And so a lot of us were saying back in 21 and 22, you probably shouldn't wait for the market to crash, because if it does crash, what's that crash going to look like? Is it 20%? Is it 25%? Well, let's just assume the market crashes here in Florida or in California. Let's just say it goes down by 20%. I would consider that a crash. You're not going to get to pre-COVID prices. The best performing state when it comes to home price appreciation was actually Maine. And that's partially due to the fact that during COVID, a lot of people were migrating out of bigger cities, and many of them were looking for Maine in order to get away from a bigger city and also to get more property, more land, to be in a much more open space. And so Maine is taking the winning number here at 73.1%. This is a chart that actually indicates household equity in real estate in the US, and you can clearly see here the dip during the COVID years, but then just a few years later, the household equity is now at an all-time high. Now, the next slide is even more visual, I think, because it actually compares renters versus homeowners and their net worth. And not surprising when it comes to being a homeowner. A homeowner's net worth on average for 2024, a homeowner has $405,000 more in net worth than a renter. The real reason for this is not that as a renter you can create net worth for yourself. You could very well, especially if you take the down payment and maybe some of the savings because you're renting and you invest it, say, in the S&P 500. But the issue is that most renters won't invest it. They'll just continue to spend money. It's another reason to become a homeowner, because you're forcing yourself to save. Then, of course, there's also appreciation over a long period of time, and the fact that it's your own home. So with that comes a lot of freedom when it comes to being able to do what you like with the home improvement and just having a kind of fit your style. This chart looks at recent home sales closings nationwide, and we've been in the negative versus same time last year up until about October 24th. And so if there was a market crash, it really came down to the volume of home sales. But now we're starting to see a trend upward over the last few months. But it'll be interesting to see what happens throughout Q2, Q3, and Q4 of this year, because there's just so much uncertainty when it comes to the administration's activities as it relates to tariffs, for example, or some of the geopolitical potential initiatives. So I mentioned earlier that when it comes to the national median price, the national housing market, it's not crashing. That's interesting, right? Because the mortgage interest rates are much higher than they were 2 years ago, and a lot of buyers are now not able to get into the housing market. But what's been driving up the prices over the last few years are home sales in the higher end, over $1 million. It's these high net worth people that have really kind of maintained the housing market when it comes to the median prices. 1 million plus versus same time last year is up by over 20%. A lot of high net earners that came into the market just over 1 year's time. But now let's look at 250K. That's actually down, partially driven by the fact that mortgage interest rates are now too high for many. They just can't cover their monthly cost. National inventory has certainly creeped up since 2024, but when compared to 2008, it is still relatively low. But yes, it's increasing, and if it continues to increase in a balanced market, we're looking at approximately 6 months of inventory. If it goes beyond that, then something's got to give. More likely than not, it's going to be the price. So we're just going to have to watch what the inventory level does. The fact is, there's still a supply issue when it comes to the demand out there, especially if the mortgage interest rates come back down again. That demand will tick up. This chart here looks at 88 million homeowners and the distribution by mortgage rates. Over 35% of current homeowners do not have a mortgage. That's a pretty big number. And so if they're not tied to the mortgage interest rate, right, that lock-in effect, based on Lawrence Yune's kind of theory here, is that they may not be selling because of capital gains. The capital gains tax could be a huge expense if a homeowner were to sell and perhaps buy somewhere else. And so what the National Association of Realtors is attempting right now is speaking to Congress in the Trump administration to getting them to bump up the capital gains exemption amount. I'm very excited about this because that's actually one reason why I wouldn't want to sell my home. And Lawrence Yune's explanation here for wanting to get this exemption bumped up and why it would make sense is that The $250,000 figure, which is if you're not married, and $500,000 figure is when you are married, that's the exemption to what you can get taxed on. That hasn't changed for 30 years at all. But meanwhile, every year there's inflation. The National Association of Realtors is looking to get the exemption indexed to inflation. If that's the case, then that figure in reality should be doubled. And so if it's not costly for those sellers, the 35% to sell, then that would bring supply to the market. Sometimes I see these videos that talk about how mortgage delinquencies is way up. We look at this graph here, it's still very, very, very low. Of course, there was, somewhat of an increase during the COVID years, but now it's very low, almost at an all-time low. So we don't really see that being an issue whatsoever. Looking at just home sales, the number of homes that are being sold, the success is going to depend on how strong a local market is when it comes to job creation, but also the mortgage interest rates. The lower they become, the more buyers are going to hit the market, and the more likely it is that home sales will increase. And then the new factor here is going to be inventory availability. Just because there's demand doesn't mean that home sales are going to go up if there's no inventory. So inventory's got to be there to satisfy the demand. Now, when the Fed started cutting rates back in September of last year, a lot of buyers expected the mortgage interest rate to follow, because that sometimes happens. And so they might have found themselves in a situation where perhaps they were working with a builder and didn't want to purchase right away because they expected the mortgage interest rates to follow later. And that unfortunately never happened. As a matter of fact, if you look at this slide here, the red line is the mortgage interest rate, 30-year. The blue line is the Fed rate. And so it doesn't always work in exact harmony. But if we look at the 10-year Treasury yield, that will move the mortgage rate. In red is the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. In green is the 10-year Treasury yield. And you can see it's almost perfectly aligned. The 10-year Treasury yield influences the mortgage rates because it's seen as a benchmark for long-term interest rates. The 10-year Treasury yield has actually been moving down because it's been anticipating that the Fed may be cutting rates in the second half of this year. And so once inflation is down, it's getting closer to that 2% target. Once it happens, the Fed rate cut will likely impact a lower mortgage rate. The Consumer Price Index is essentially a basket of different products and services. It helps us understand how prices are evolving over time. At one point, prices went up by almost, in the CPI, by almost 10%. But the Fed's target is to go back down to close to 2%. Now, February of this year, it was at 2.8, but it certainly is getting closer to 2%. And so when we say that prices are going to come down, more likely than not, prices aren't going to come down, but the price appreciation is going to be leveled off by roughly 2%. The only way to really keep up with inflation and being able to afford more is if you figure out how to increase the money that you bring home, whether it is by getting a second job, or perhaps you're getting a job promotion, or maybe you're changing jobs altogether. Maybe you're getting that second or third job. That's the only way you're going to be able to afford more, because prices, more likely than not, will not go into a deflationary mode because it's not the Fed's target. Here's the forecast for 2025 and 2026. Let's look at existing home sales first. We've already seen in one of the previous charts that home sales are starting to tick up again. Over the last 4 months they have. And so the prediction is that we're going to see an increase of existing home sales by 9% for this year. By 2026, it could be 13%. And granted, this is just based on the information that Laurence Yun had today, but with everything happening in the economy on a grander scale, this is going to change. New home sales are going to be up by 11%, expected to be up yet again in 2026. And so if you're a real estate agent watching right now, this is good news because there's going to be more to sell. Home prices are expected to just slightly appreciate by 2% this year, 2% next year. Key takeaway for somebody that's looking to purchase this year is that you don't have to rush. Prices will not change that much, with the exception of seasonality. Here in Florida, typically the prices will come down in the summertime and they will peak sometime in Q1, Q2 of the following year, so in the spring season. Mortgage rates are expected to be near 6%, both in 2025 and 2026. Job gains, based on his statistical model, we're looking at nearly 2 million added in 2025, and in 2026, the same. And there you go, there's the forecast for 2025 and 2026. I'm sure this is going to be rolling based on more information coming in from the administration. And I know Lawrence Yun typically has these presentations every quarter. The next time he has it, I'll make sure that I report out to you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to call me, email me anytime now if you're somebody that's looking to sell or purchase a home in the area I work in, which is in Florida, Southwest Florida, Sarasota, Venice, Bradenton, and Lakewood Ranch. I would love to work with you and assist you in your journey. Thank you so much for watching today. Do me a favor, like this video, subscribe to this channel, and have a great day.